I see that we have a quorum, and so this business meeting will commence. We meet today to vote on the nomination of Scott Bessent to be Secretary of the Treasury. Senator Wyden and I have discussed that we will each give our opening remarks, and then we will proceed immediately to a vote. If any members of the committee would like to make comments, they may freely do so. I will remain afterwards, after the vote, and anyone who wishes to speak may speak at that time. Mr. Bessent has decades of academic, professional, and leadership experience relevant to this position, as well as the gravitas, demeanor, and character to be an effective secretary. Mr. Bessent has also thoughtfully responded to our questions during the rigorous, diligent process, and his hearing, and in the course of that hearing, has answered 200+ questions for the record, not including the subparts. These are questions that have been asked by members of this committee and have been responded to carefully by him with thousands of documents. There is no doubt that Mr. Bessent is an excellent choice for Secretary of the Treasury. He has my vote. In prior Congresses, I've joined with many of my Republican colleagues in voting for well-qualified Treasury Secretary candidates put forward by a Democrat president, even though I did not agree with all of the positions which they advocated. I encourage my colleagues on both sides of the aisle today to join in advancing this well-qualified nominee. And now I recognize Senator Wyden for his remarks.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I want my colleagues to know why I strongly oppose this nominee. First, this nominee is not square on his taxes. Like others on Wall Street, he has opted out of paying his fair share of his Medicare taxes. The IRS has gone to court twice to ban this particular scheme that Mr. Bessent is using. Treasury policy says what Mr. Bessent is doing is against the law. Apparently he disagrees, and maybe he'll pay his Medicare taxes sometime down the road. And remember, this is an individual who's a billionaire. It's not going to be a hardship on him to pay his Medicare taxes. My view is you cannot have a Treasury Secretary who doesn't abide by Treasury policy. That is what you are going to have on day one if Mr. Bessent is confirmed. That's number one. Number two, I think Mr. Bessent came to this committee completely unprepared to answer some of the most basic questions about tax policy. He was asked a critically important one. Should wages be treated differently than wealth? This is the central debating question, colleagues, on taxes about whether the ultra-wealthy should get a better deal than people who work for a living. Mr. Bessent bobbed and weaved a little bit and basically said, that's just the way it is. He might as well have said, let him eat cake. And that's what we're dealing with here. Last point I want to make deals with an issue that came in writing last night provided by Mr. Bessent. According to news reports, longtime Trump advisor Boris Epstein ran a quid pro quo scheme during the 2024 campaign. He told certain people seeking cabinet appointments that if they paid him hundreds of thousands of dollars, he'd push Trump to nominate them. After reading these reports, I felt that the committee needed an answer to what actually happened. So in December, I sent a letter to Mr. Bessent and the Trump transition with straightforward questions about this. Last week, I asked Mr. Bessent about it in our one-on-one meeting. He told me Mr. Epstein talked to him about payments for public relations, which is a pretty sleazy way of pitching a quid pro quo. The reason I bring it up is Mr. Bessent has now given a different answer in response to a written question after the hearing. His new answer is nobody ever asked him about payments in exchange for an appointment. He still won't reveal who else in Trump's orbit he talked to about it. Colleagues, this smells. It is a significant question that warrants additional follow-up. So for the reasons that I just outlined, I think we ought to have somebody in this job who pays his Medicare taxes. I think we ought to have somebody who treats people who make wages fairly and not just people who are well-to-do. And third, because there are significant issues surrounding, Mr. Epstein and the nominee. I urge my colleagues to support this individual, to oppose this individual.
Thank you, Senator Wyden. We're just waiting one moment for one more senator to arrive, and we will proceed with the vote. While we're waiting for that, maybe you and I could have a little colloquy on the comments that you just made.
Absolutely.
My understanding is that Mr. Bessent has made it very clear with regard to Boris Epstein that he never sought assistance from him and never paid him anything, directly or indirectly. And I understand that you're now asking him to comment on what conversations may have been held with anyone else and that he's not responding to those. But the point is that I don't believe you can discourage support for him because he never, ever sought any assistance from Mr. Epstein or paid him anything or anyone else anything for his candidacy.
We have a quorum, but I would only say that his answer in writing is different than the answer he has given elsewhere. That's troubling enough, particularly given the amount of corruption we're seeing associated with Mr. Epstein.
Thank you. I see that we do have a quorum, and so we will now proceed to the vote. We have a very solid quorum. I move that the committee favorably report the nomination of the Honorable Scott Bessent of South Carolina to be Treasury Secretary. Is there a second?
I second.
Having been duly seconded, the clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Grassley.
Aye.
Mr. Grassley, aye. Mr. Cornyn.
Aye.
Mr. Cornyn, aye. Mr. Thune.
Aye.
Mr. Thune, aye. Mr. Scott.
Aye.
Mr. Scott, aye. Mr. Cassidy.
Aye.
Mr. Cassidy, aye. Mr. Langford.
Aye.
Mr. Langford, aye. Mr. Daines.
Aye.
Mr. Daines, aye. Mr. Young. Mr. Young, aye. Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Barrasso, aye. Mr. Johnson.
Aye.
Mr. Johnson, aye. Mr. Tillis.
Aye.
Mr. Tillis, aye. Mrs. Blackburn. Mrs. Blackburn, aye. Mr. Marshall.
Aye.
Mr. Marshall, aye. Mr. Wyden.
No.
Mr. Wyden, no. Ms. Cantwell. No. Ms. Cantwell, no. Mr. Bennett. Mr. Bennett, no. Mr. Warner.
Aye.
Mr. Warner, aye. Mr. Whitehouse.
No.
Mr. Whitehouse, no. Ms. Hassan.
Aye.
Ms. Hassan, aye. Ms. Cortez Masto.
No.
Ms. Cortez Masto, no. Ms. Warren.
No by proxy.
Ms. Warren, no by proxy. Mr. Sanders.
No.
Mr. Sanders, no. Ms. Smith. Ms. Smith, no. Mr. Lujan. Mr. Lujan, no. Mr. Warnock.
No.
Mr. Warnock, no. Mr. Welch. Mr. Welch, no. Mr. Chairman.
Aye.
Chairman votes aye. Mr. Chairman, the final tally is 16 ayes, 11 nays.
Thank you. The nomination is reported favorably. I appreciate all of your attendance today at this meeting, and the committee stands in recess. We are, actually, if there are statements, I apologize. We will come back into session. And are there any statements? Senator Welch.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. The issue of concern to me in my no vote today is the situation where there's an ongoing dispute between the taxpayer and the IRS. The taxpayer will soon be the head of the IRS by virtue of serving as the as Secretary of the Department of Treasury. And my view is that it is in the interest of public confidence in the Secretary that tax dispute be resolved before the full Senate votes on this nomination. It'll be very difficult for the public to be totally confident that this is an on-the-level resolution of the dispute when he would be the Secretary of the Treasury while the dispute is underway. So my hope is that Mr. Bessent will resolve the dispute before the Senate votes in full on his nomination, and I'd reserve the right to take that into account in my vote on the floor. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, Senator Wyden.
My colleague from Vermont, as usual, is making an important point, because this is an issue that relates to a double standard. I mean, all over this country, small businesses and individuals are paying these Medicare taxes in Vermont and Oregon. And what has concerned me about the outset is here we have a billionaire. It's not as if this would work a hardship on him to pay his Medicare taxes, and he has been unwilling in basically using what we talked about in this committee often, which is if you can put it off and put it off and put it off, sometimes it just goes away and you make money while you put it off. So I thank my colleague, a very constructive suggestion, interested in working with him on that. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman?
We'll rotate and then come back. Is that right?
Okay.
Senator Marshall.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to express how enthusiastic I am about future Secretary Bessent's nomination. I think I've had the privilege of interviewing a few people in my lifetime now, and I can't share enough how encouraged I was with my interview with him on a personal basis, that he's not only a leader, but he understands the challenges of everyday families, that he's a person who's lived the American dream, and I think he understands the struggles of everyday Americans now as well. I like his priorities to grow the economy, to address the federal fiscal deficit, to increase oil production, to bring down the price of gas and groceries, rent and mortgages, so that other Americans like him can live this same American dream. I like his commitment to making the Trump tax cuts permanent as well. And again, just a commitment to those people that carry a lunch pail to work. Obviously, he's been very successful on Wall Street, but he's from rural America, from a small town America. And again, I'm just so appreciative of his commitment that every American has that shot at the same American dream that so many of us have had. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. And Senator Whitehouse.
2 points, if I may. One is that, 30 years ago, nominees for cabinet positions withdrew their nominations for failing to pay probably hundreds of dollars, at worst thousands of dollars in taxes. It earned the Watergate appellation, was called Nannygate. And here we are 30 years later, and we have an individual who has dodged $900,000 in contributions to Medicare, which to me is very telling. It speaks to, as the ranking member has said, the double standard in America. If you're a billionaire, you're not expected to follow the rules. Everybody else is expected to follow the rules. I agree that we need an answer to this question, but it would seem to me that the proper answer to this question is, while this is the position of the IRS and the Treasury, he should take it and pay his taxes. The conflict of interest of becoming the overseer of the IRS and the Secretary of the Treasury is apparent, and I think that's really significant. The other thing I wanted to mention is that I think we have underestimated what is going to happen as a result of climate change. I think we've underestimated it very badly. I think we've underestimated it as the result of a largely fraudulent campaign by the fossil fuel industry to mislead the public about what is happening. We are now towards the end of a very long period of lies by the fossil fuel industry about what climate change really is, how it works, what the science is, and what's likely to happen. And we're now entering the period of consequences. And we are seeing those consequences in Florida in the insurance markets. We're seeing those consequences in California in insurance markets. I think there's every reason to believe that an insurance crisis is looming. The former chief economist of Freddie Mac, which is not exactly a green organization, and cares a lot about mortgages, has said and then testified that as the insurance markets melt down because climate change has made risk unpredictable, that cascades into a failure in mortgage markets because you need insurance to get a mortgage. And if you can't get a mortgage on your property unless you're a billionaire and some other billionaire can come buy cash, but if you actually need to sell to somebody who, like you, needs a mortgage to afford the house, then you don't have buyers any longer. And that creates what, in his phrase, would be a coastal property values crash. Now, beside the coastal property values crash he warned of, there's a wildfire property values crash that is looming as well, that wasn't considered then because the growth in wildfire risk has happened so explosively. But if you look at the combination of coastal property values crash risk and wildfire adjacent property values risk, and you look at what that is already starting to do to insurance markets, and you look at the warnings that have come from many places, if you doubt me, go get the April issue of The Economist magazine. Again, not a green publication, warning that the foundations of the world's largest asset class, the real estate industry, are being shaken by what is taking place. This isn't just a coastal problem. It's not just an American problem. This is actually a global problem, and I think it portends very significant global financial shock. And as best I can tell, the nominee doesn't want to hear about it, isn't interested, couldn't care less, and like the rest of the Trump administration, is essentially in tow to the fossil fuel industry, which is on the cusp of causing very, very significant economic pain. So for both of those reasons, I voted no.
Thank you, Senator Whitehouse. I'd like to just respond to some of the comments that have been made here. With regard to the global warming issues, I don't think that it's just a fair characterization to say that the nominee doesn't care about the global warming issues that we face. But I guess that's an argument that we will be engaged in for some time beyond today's meeting.
Yes, sir.
But with regard to the nominee and the implication that was made here that he has failed to pay his taxes, that is simply false. The issue is one on which the nominee has filed his taxes in compliance with standard existing tax law. But the Internal Revenue Service, not just with regard to this nominee, but with regard to many, many taxpayers, is seeking to change its interpretation of the law at issue. And if the Internal Revenue Service's change of that interpretation is accepted, then he would owe taxes, as would many, many other people. This issue is in court. Not in a case that he has brought, but in a case that another taxpayer has brought against the IRS trying to change the rules. And the nominee, Mr. Bessent, has stated that he has fully complied with traditional tax law and is prepared, if the IRS position prevails in court and the rules change, to pay the tax that is due. And he has even set aside a reserve fund to do so. He has done nothing wrong except follow traditional tax law, and has stated that if the Internal Revenue Service does prevail in its litigation to change the interpretation of how standard practice has proceeded in the past, then he will comply with that new interpretation. I think that it's eminently fair.
If my colleague will just yield briefly, because he and I have some other things to talk about in addition to this. Just so it's clear, because tax policy is pretty dense kind of mumbo jumbo. The reality is, if Mr. Bessent is confirmed tomorrow, he will go to his office the next day and will be serving in a way that is not compliant with Treasury and the IRS position on this issue of Medicare taxes. That's not a question of appeals and all the rest. That is a question of what will happen the day after he takes his seat. And that's what's so troubling, because on that day, there will be a double standard all over America. People who pay their Medicare taxes on time will, in effect, say, the person who's in charge of this at Treasury is not in compliance with the policy of two bodies, the IRS and Treasury.
Well, I will give you this. He will be the Secretary of Treasury if he is confirmed by the Senate. And the bottom line is, he has still made it very clear that he will comply if the IRS position is what is determined by courts of law to be the new position of tax policy. He will comply with it. With that, is there anything further on the nomination discussion today? All right, with that, then the committee will be in recess.